Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us to this lecture series today. My name is Ibrahim Victoria, and I will be introducing Mr. James Inedu-George. He is a Rolex Mentor and Protegee Program 2017 nominee. He is an award-winning architect that practices in Africa and international. He serves as the design head of HTL in Nigeria. He has studied architecture at the Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria, Nigeria. His architecture is based highly on the mining of typologies from the current uses of the MegaCity and the re-engineering of global cities for maximum efficiencies with these typologies. He has lectured and exhibited severally in universities and biennales globally, some of which have been at the University of Pennsylvania, Florida International University, and the University of Florida, among others. He recently was also the African architect in residence at the University of Gainesville, Florida. Lastly, James is cited as the architect for the Pan-African Heritage Museum to be built in Winneba, Ghana, outside of capital city of Accra. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming James Inedu-George.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to everybody who's joined online. And thanks you guys for coming. Like I've been saying all day, I haven't slept, so don't expect the most organized lecture from me. Secondly, I only had a few minutes to go around the city. It's a beautiful place. It has its charm, but I never knew such great architecture could also be kind of mirrored with so much pain. But that's a lecture for another day, if I can get the chance to do that. Anyways, my lecture today is called Questions for Architecture. And really just musings and trying new understandings for what's going on in the world of architecture as we see it where I come from. So I practice in Nigeria. I run a practice in Nigeria, also with offices in Dubai, and I practice around the world. We try to do things that are new, but are also entrenched in the ethos of the way that we as Africans work. So our idea is to try to export an African narrative around the world that can help in this time in this need of sustainability and global change, to export a new type of love and a new type of architecture around the world and tell new stories. So this lecture is not, like I said earlier, I don't expect an organized lecture from me. I typically would have my notes as organized as possible. But I feel as if we're in a time of urgency in the world. And at this time, action is needed more than all the talk that we've been accustomed to. From all the happenings in the world, from the riots in America to the price hikes in the UK to the natural disasters in Africa, put together, the world is at a precipice, and architecture is at the fulcrum of that precipice. Everything else is changing. Questions are being asked to everything. I mean, we're questioning the basis of gender, but architecture itself has been able to slightly dodge away from those questions by painting facades in certain colors and by planting trees on roofs, not helping the environment, not changing the environment, and not being questioned in the way that everything else is questioned. So this lecture is an attempt to start that kind of question so that we can look inward to ourselves and ask ourselves, what can architecture contribute in this age of questioning, in this age where everything is up for grabs in the most, what's the word now? In the most violent way that humanity has ever been up for grabs before. So architecture generally has lived in a cloud of misunderstanding the last 100 years. 100 years this year, Le Corbusier released the book Towards a New Architecture. and defined architecture as the masterful and correct play of forms in light. Then, for the next 100 years, architecture has been mired with a trial and error of definitions that oscillate between less and more. Mies van der Rohe, less is more. Bjarke Ingels, yes is more. Barack Obama, etc. So we're oscillating between two words over 100 years without the bravery to say what architecture should be in a time where architecture is needed. So my lecture is trying to ask those questions as disorganized as possible. It's trying to ask those questions to see if we can together find answers and push architecture with new rules and new canons and ethos for the next 100 years. So again, when you hear an African architect or an African scholar is coming to give a lecture, you expect to hear beautiful drum beats and be serenaded with stories from village X or village Y. But I don't come from village X or village Y. I'm as urban as any of you, as educated as most people. And I don't have any stories to tell you. I come from a lot of money, so I really don't understand those stories myself. And Africa has changed in the last 100 years too. Africa is not the place of stories anymore. It's the place of realities that are changing the world. Africa is exporting Africans to the world to change the dynamics of the world as we know it. The globe is spinning on African intelligence. So it's time for us to stop expecting these stories and start waiting to hear of the victories that Africa is bringing towards the world. This is one of those victories. So again, it's not the most organized of them, but it's the beginning of something great. Like I said, the last architectural revolution that made any sense was Corbusier's revolution in 1923, where there was a proper definition of what architecture could be. Engineering, based on engineering it was, but it was a proper definition of what architecture's capabilities in the 20th century, given technology and given the way the people behaved, what architecture could do. And it has left us in a haze. And we've lived in that haze for years and years. And we all go to school, and there are no rules of architecture. So we go to school and just learn how to put walls together. And that knowledge is not changing architecture, let alone the world. And architecture should be at the forefront of changing the global narrative, right? Because the job of an architect is to, even if it's to assume a future, it's to bring that future to life in the present time with the hope that his delirium of bringing something that he hasn't seen to life becomes the direction of the world. In my mind, Steve Jobs was an architect. He didn't practice architecture. In my mind, the Tesla guy is an architect. He's bringing another realization into the world. So architecture has lost that ability to bring new visions into the world. We are trying to take architecture from this dream of observation to not a new dream, but back to the dream of creating visions, to stand on what we believe in, because we believe in it, and we can make it work if we're given the chance. The job of an architect is to find that chance to change the world. It's not to observe the world as it is. The world as it is, flawed as it may be, or great as it may be, is in the present. Our job is to try and see, in fact, just building generally. A building takes what, 3, 4, 5 years? That's a futuristic. So you can't build in the past. You have to build in the future. So architecture has to find a way to build in the future. So having said all that, I think I have to click on this thing. How does this work? Fabulous. So this is our office in Lagos, one of the offices we run. It's a totally black space with 2 white walls, but we work like this. We sit on the ground, make things together, collaborate. There's no hierarchy. Of course, every architect sees that, but there's truly no hierarchy because I'm quite an informal person, right? So my staff dress like that as if they're in university. It's all good. We figure out a way to make things happen. We build scale models from found materials, and then we discuss those models and try to add some value into parts of we start from our city, Lagos, into parts of that city that can't grow without architecture. So some years ago, we almost got famous internationally. We did something and somebody saw it somewhere, and then it got on Amazing Architecture, when Amazing Architecture was a thing. And suddenly we started to receive calls from people we didn't know. It was quite jarring, and it had the opposite effect on the entire office. While most people run towards the fame to try to take as much of the limelight as possible, we thought that we needed to look at where we're coming from, to see what it was that we could bring to the world with the eyeballs that were seeing us. So that building got built. It was actually a renovation. Nobody knows. Every time I talk about it, it looks like it's a new building. There was an existing building, which is to your far left, that we demolished the facade of, and then gutted the interior, and created this to the far right. And suddenly that becomes this building, and this building becomes that, and that becomes that building. So we built it ourselves. We did the contracting, which is something we don't like to do very often. But we did it because nobody else wanted to take on the risk of building a doubly bent facade on 3 floors made of light steel sheets that were sprayed with mud, because nobody could take the risk of it not working. But we did, and it worked. So that's it that's a drone shot of it. That's it at night. That's it wrapped as a Christmas gift. So we have that capability to make interesting architecture. But I must say that's not what we do. This is a mistake. In my complete world, this stands out as something we did just because, right? But that building made us to start asking questions of origins. So I come from the north of Nigeria, and in the north of Nigeria, the architecture is really strong. I like to say that Nigeria is in 3 layers. There's a music layer. That's the layer that everybody knows. Lagos, all the Afro beats. That comes from that Lagos strip. That's where my office is. But I come from the north, the desert strip. The desert strip is known for its architecture and its architectural understanding. And the middle strip is known for food. So that tripartite understanding of Nigeria makes one whole country that becomes indivisible. The origins of architecture, however, are built around master builders. Of course, that's general, but a certain master builder in the north of Nigeria, who's pictured here, shown in his ragged clothes on his site, building a building that he will eventually be killed for, was called Babangoni Mikhail, the head of building. His name is Mikhail. Architecture was so important in the north of Nigeria that kings would kill architects after they build their palaces, that nobody else shall ever live in a palace that magnificent. And we lost that kind of importance, right? So these are the kind of things he built. What he built was a house that was a city block, not a house that was a single part of the city. The house itself functioned as a city block, and the collection of city blocks made the entire city function in a very particular way. He also built the interiors of those houses, as you can see on the right-hand side of the image. He built the interiors of, because the house he built at the base is Zaria Mosque. He built the interiors with these arches that help to span the mud in a certain way. Now, the trick about this, however, is that the mud brick technology, not the engineering, but the mud brick technology was perfected by a Spaniard who followed Mansa Musa from Hajj in Saudi Arabia through Spain. He came from Spain to Saudi Arabia, followed Mansa Musa to Mali, and that trickled down to northern Nigeria. So again, that unity of the world is something that we see in architecture that is not very well emphasized. Anyways, so if you look at that architecture, you start to understand the stark difference between the African mindset and the European and Western mindset. Both of them genius mindset. But in Africa, what matters is the spirit of an object. In Europe, what matters is the detail of an object. The understanding of that makes you start to question the assumptions, the basic assumptions by which architecture is taught, especially African architecture. Because instead of teaching mastery of detail in Africa, we should teach mastery of spirit. What does the architecture do? How does it affect the environment? As against, how does it look? How is it put together? How perfect are its parts? So knowing that also opens up a new kind of understanding as to how to see African architecture. So note, this is the first assumption that I'm trying to dispel. We have to stop looking at some traditional architecture in the same way as we look at, for instance, the classical architecture, because they weren't built of the same spirit. They were built of different spirits, and the goal of the architecture was vastly different. So of course, Picasso saw the traditional African forms, and he, in his intelligence, thought that it was an attempt to see an object, for instance, my bottle, from all its perspectives at once. Hence, he created, him and George FRAC created Cubism, trying to see objects, all the objects layered at once. But in Africa, there's no art in traditional Africa. These things they are a representation of how a man sees his God, or how a man sees his spirit. So two of the same objects can look the same, but won't be the same, because it's a spiritual representation of a man's communication with his God. It's not art. Art is put in museums. In Africa, we never built them. So Picasso, with his great understanding, didn't see that what was being put there wasn't a sculpture, it was a piece of spirit. So of course, the second assumption to open up things is how we see the house. Schwechfiger, who was my lecturer, wrote a seminal book on house architecture, F.W. Schwechfiger, and then Zeno Demarkowski, the Polish guy, also wrote another seminal book, where they define the house in Hausa tradition as the pavilions inside the compound. The compound is what's shaded in red over there, and the pavilions are each of those individual pavilions. So that was the house. And by defining the house as that single pavilion, the house became so empty that it had no architecture in it. But the Hausa man made his entire fence his house. That fence was a series of pavilions floating in free space. But we looked at it as a fence and a series of houses. Then we call this free space a courtyard, and that space is not really a courtyard. So those are two assumptions that have been. So what we call in our office house, not compound, is we look at the house in traditional Africa for all its merits. And the house is a system. It has a farm in it. It has social spaces. It has interaction spaces. It has pavilions for sleeping. And it has the possibility to encourage outdoor living, right? Which is what the house, the traditional house taught in architecture doesn't do. But where we come from, the tropical part where we come from, this is what is needed for comfort and to enhance the environment. So again, like the sculpture, the architecture is a system, not an object. Art is an object. Spiritual objects are systems because they are passed from generation to generation and tell a story through generation. So also the house is a system because in this house, there's life and death. Traditional house, some of the pavilions, when the owner of the pavilion dies, it's allowed to fall into itself, right? He's most probably buried in the house. When that house collapses onto itself, several generations later, somebody builds another house on top of that house. So there's life and there's death. But in the conventional house, there's only life and demolition. So the words that we use to describe our houses are different. Yeah, so of course this is great architecture from Rome. There are personal photos of mine, St. Peter's below, Maria Maggiore at the top. Perfection of line, perfection of detail, combination of form, Le Corbusier, the perfect and masterful combination of forms in light, of pure forms in light. So when you can describe Le Corbusier's definition of architecture as a more Eurocentric definition, in the sense that in Europe, architecture is the masterful and correct play of simple geometry in light. In several other cultures, however, not so. In Africa, darkness is more important than light. There's so much sun that you want to be in the darkest space to get the least light and the most cooling. So the house becomes a cooling machine. In Europe, it doesn't have to cool. So while in the 1920s and 30s, Europeans ran towards air conditioning, the Africans just kept building their houses as systems until colonization took over and we had to start living in air conditioning. Air conditioning works horribly in Africa. In fact, it doesn't work. It stains your walls, it smells, it's expensive, there's nowhere to put it. So after you do all this great architecture, you hang the air conditioning on walls, right? I'm building something now that we're having to find a large space on the roof to put air conditioning. And I've spent all this time designing the roof, and the roof is not a flat roof. But now we have to find a place to put air conditioning on 7,000 square meters. So it's 7,000 square meters, that's about 70,000 square feet. You can imagine that volume of air conditioning. So, of course, European architecture is also known for using regular division of forms, repetition, and all those rules of architecture. In Africa, it's different. There's a molding, there's a sensitivity, there's a touch that is different. There's a rising to a pyramidal form so that wind can flow with, can batter on the walls. There's closeness of buildings in the urban setting so that they are shadowed and canopies don't need to be built and people can always walk around, right? So things like that become very important. But you see, today we're using Rhino to try to develop those kind of forms in Los Angeles. And for me, it doesn't make sense because one was developed by hand, the other is developed by grasshopper, right? So, but you can see that the intelligence of the one by hand is still the intelligence of the one by hand. The intelligence of the one by grasshopper, beautiful as it may be, is a little bit offish, if you ask me. So the third assumption is the assumption of vision and observation. So like Le Corbusier, I said, 1923, towards the new architecture, had a definition of architecture, created an architectural revolution. For 100 years, we're oscillating within it. Was still, there are two camps after Le Corbusier's definition. There's the Corbusian camp and the Mies van der Rohe's camp. Mies van der Rohe's camp seems to have worn out. And so architecture has been oscillating between less and more for 100 years. It's like a ping pong match. Sometimes more is more, sometimes less is less, sometimes less is a ball, sometimes it's just the same thing. Sometimes yes is more, whatever that means, right? So what had happened is that after Le Corbusier and his ilk, who put vision at the forefront of architecture and the creating of a new language and city, etc., at the forefront of architecture, we find learning from Las Vegas, small, medium, large, and extra large, and such books, Chaos and Contradiction, such books as manuals of observation of the city and surrender to it, saying that the city is the city. We can't do better than this. So we might as well surrender and just live with whatever the consequence is. So because of that, it has become difficult for architects to make any proper addition to the world as we see it. So again, we're mired in legal work, and mired in all sorts of chirping. Nothing gets done, right? So Corbusier's thesis of form in his book is summarized on the right-hand side in 4 diagrams. You can make a square building, in 3 ways. You can make an L-shaped building, but all that is to create a certain kind of architecture. It's in the same way, it's the same kind of thinking that Vitruvius would have about the temples, the kinds of temples. But we move from all that to Renkola, that guides today. And he says that Manhattan is a playground for every theory of architecture to live side by side with each other. What he calls the city of the something. Sorry, that skips me. So our question is there a way that we can find a new moment in architecture to make a series of rules that can guide us in a certain direction? So in summary of all the things I've said, first things first, African architecture, as strong as it is also made by a communication between the West and Africa. The Tubali brick comes from a Spaniard who met a Malian and brought to the north of Africa. Also, the fabric on the right-hand side, if you ever travel to Africa, you see these fabrics every day. They're not African, they're Dutch. It's actually called Dutch wax. It has nothing to do with Africa, but they are used for religious celebrations in Africa. So it means that there's a hybridization of objects that we're not taking cognizance of, that has changed the world. And architecture is not taking its moment at the forefront of this change. Right? Yinka Shonibare, the renowned artist, has taken that moment as an artist to make this Star Trek-ish mask with Dutch wax, and he makes all the other figures in that same light. So that hybridization has come to life, but we are not taking that moment. So again, if I summarize the first few pages of what I've said, from the understanding of African architecture, it must harness the best resources in its microenvironment. Of course, I stated here, say that the best architecture is one that harnesses these resources to create performance. Performance for me and for us as a company is extremely at the forefront of all architecture. The goal of architecture is two things: ubiquity and performance. Anything else is out of it. So, again, Le Corbusier proposed his pure forms. We're proposing more hybridized forms so that everybody can be included into it, right? Because the pure forms are an exclusionary mode. A hybrid form is an inclusionary mode. So perhaps we need to find more of these inclusionary modes. So, like I said at the beginning, architecture today generally is in search of fixed points and reference and points of reference to synthesize technology in a new way and make a new kind of house so that we can all have access to it. So today, questioning gender, questioning morals, questioning the sky, questioning your government, questioning yourself, COVID. I can go on and on. I can list things for the next 30 minutes. We're at the age of responsibility. Greta is the poster child of responsibility. That is, 17-year-old girl can tell 70-year-old men that this is not your earth anymore. The world has changed. But architecture is still stubborn, trying to make beautiful colors. And trying to asking, I had a call today that they're asking me for the RAL color specification of a lamp post. How important is that? Absolutely not, right? So architecture's goal has been the pursuit of beauty. Clandestinely, we've pursued beauty for the last 100 years. But the pursuit of beauty has done absolutely nothing for architecture. And I can prove it to you, maybe in another lecture. But if you think about it quite deeply, you realize that all beautiful buildings rarely work well. And all buildings that work very well are rarely beautiful, right? Therefore, again, I say, the pursuit of beauty has done absolutely nothing for architecture. So perhaps we should agree not to pursue beauty and pursue something else. So the first question that comes to mind for us, and especially for me, is sustainability as we know it, is it a necessity? And the way we talk about sustainability, is it a real thing? Because LED, green, those things are just ways of calculating how many air conditioners we've taken out of the building. They're not real. I've seen real sustainability. I'll tell you a story. When I was growing up, opposite me, opposite my father's house, was a traditional mud house where a Hausa man lived with his 4 wives. Our house was a mansion. I hated being at home. I loved being in the house. Why? Because the house, it unfolded itself like a story every day. When you go from one part to another, there was a change. It was little pavilions in free space. And things were happening. Different colors, change, different roofs, different activities and pockets of activities happening. But my house was just a house. There was a living room, a dining room, a kitchen, several bedrooms, and a corridor. There was nothing to do. But every time I went there was always something to write about, right? And so, but those houses were cooler than the house I lived in. The waste was expelled easier, etc. Materials were better used than the house I lived in. So the question I ask now is, all this sustainability trope and painting a certain color and stacking trees, and of course we do that, green roofs, what does it really mean cumulatively? Is it real? What does it mean? It's not just an extra cost for architecture, right? So in the time that we were questioning this, we were called to do a competition in Lagos, Nigeria. Now, fortunately for us, there was a piece of land that was supposed to be, like 20-story hotel was supposed to be built, but they didn't have the money for that. But they wanted to build a lifestyle center for the next 5-6 years. So they hired us they called us for a competition. And so we decided to make a temporary building that was like a car that you could dismantle and use the parts in the building itself. And the way we went about it was simple. We divided the building into three simple techniques. There was the beam or the super slab, and then there were the columns or the trees. So the columns were made of light gauge steel, 100 mm, about 4 inches. So 4 inches square pipes. So we made these tightly packed columns so that the structure was not based on the 4-inch square pipe, but it was made based by the touching of the big mega columns. And those mega columns could be lived inside. So you can dismantle those columns and use them for something else. And then the super slab was also made of steel and connected to make this post and lintel that became the architecture. So in a simple way, it just becomes like an iconic building on the streets with art in front of it. It was just simple upside down pyramids inside the slab that could be dismantled as quickly as it was put together. That's another view of it. And that's how the interiors look. Without having to do any interior design, we were able to make, just put a few red chairs and a few pattern chairs. It turns into architecture. So for me, it's also the need to be able to make architecture as quickly as possible without all the typical fuss of it that becomes sustainability. Because sustainability is also time. And if we spend 5 years designing one building, how sustainable can it be? So I'll just show you a quick video of, just a quick run through of how the building is. So again, it's a simple glass slab that is connected to these trees and suspended off the ground. So it's not really architecture, but coincidentally it becomes architecture. Again, it brings to mind those pavilions in free space, right? And light being able to filter through cut spaces in the beam, which reduces the weight, the dead weight of the beam. So we call it a lifestyle city because we were able to put all sorts of activities inside it that didn't have anything to do with the lifestyle, like a sculpture park to bring art to the city. Lagos is a place that is quite devoid of art and parks. So we turned our building, half of our building, into a public park, etc. So there's a sports and fitness part on the site. And then of course, the building connects directly with a ramp from the pool area directly to the top of the slab, where you can have a panoramic view of the neighborhood. Okay, so I need to close this down. Yeah. Okay, so the next question is a question that I think every architect has asked himself recently. Should architecture solely involve itself in the creation of systems? Because that's what architecture can do. Architecture can make systems simple. Beauty is a consequence of that, but architecture can make systems. And when architecture makes systems, it's cheaper to make, it's quicker to make, and it has more use and larger place in humanity than just building a house. So we competed in Dubai during the pandemic. In Dubai and Abu Dhabi, there are two different projects, but this was for breathing systems on the RTA, the metro, the famous Dubai metro. So the pedestrian bridges, we were creating these breathing bulbs at the side, so that as cars pass, there are large wind tunnels that can trap the speed of the cars and the train and convert it into energy and all that. So we were doing that in Dubai, and so that's a typical road. People can use it as a public park, but of course it's actually it's urban infrastructure. It's not designed, like I said, to be beautiful. The curves are based on the speed of the cars, so that it's streamlined in a way that airflow can be maximized and turned into energy. So the skin is a planter, and then inside that planter becomes a park for pedestrians. Dubai has no real parks, no impromptu parks like parks in the city. So these kind of vertical, and Dubai is a vertical city. So these kind of vertical parks will create a break for people under that 50 degrees Celsius sun. 50 degrees Celsius is only God knows what's in Fahrenheit. It's uncalculable, right? So this created a break for people and also generated money for the city, because it helped to reduce the amount of electricity bill for the street lighting and the lights and the travelators in the tube, right? So it was a series of stacked parks and these planters that we were hoping to be 3D printed. And after that project, I lost faith in 3D printing because it didn't quite make it to what I wanted, right? So anyways, the next question is, should good architecture not align itself with business concerns? Architects are known primarily to abhor business, to hate politics, and to shy away from anything that makes them talk about money. But our profession is one of the most expensive professions in the world. Daily, it becomes much more risky to be an architect as things become pricier. In some countries, people don't build anymore because of the price, but architects don't concern themselves more. I don't myself, but I'm having to deal with it head on. So we're doing this adaptive reuse project. We're making this is an existing warehouse. It was built in 2016, 2017 in Abuja. My office is in Lagos. Abuja is the capital city of Nigeria. It's hot and dry, but it has 3-4 months of quite heavy rains. So this site is in a valley. And as you can see from the areas around it, there's an embankment around it that helps to bring water into all these gutters here that drain into the city drain, right? It's in a hotel. The main entrance to the hotel is at this point. And there's a ramp around that brings you to the site, that brings you to the lowest, this is the lowest point of the site. So it's like a bucket in a way. So we had this warehouse 6 meters high, but you could only see the roof from the road, right? And we're called to do an event and performance space in that box. So we had two choices. Either we break down the thing and start again, which they couldn't afford In fact, we proposed that as a point. And we got a bill, and right, we had to choose, do we want those fees or not? And we wanted the fees. So we had to start to learn how money works. So the second option was to reuse and expand this facility. That was 5,000 square meters as is. We expanded to 7,000, which is a large building. 7,000 square meters, like I said, that's times 10. That's about 70,000 square feet. Right, so that's a picture of how it looks in sunken nature. Right, so what we did was to keep the warehouse as it is and add a swooping form that breathes on its own to the warehouse and put all the facilities, the external facilities, kitchens, toilets, entrance hall, blah, 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 inside this new 20 meters, 60 feet long, 60 foot by 300 foot long entrance building, and then add that to the warehouse itself. So the warehouse remained, but we just changed the format of its structure to pull it from the outside. So basically this building is really just a way to pull the portal frames back so that we could remove all the columns in the interior and have a free space. So what looks like a building is actually just performing a structural thing. And all the vents are actually active vents that help to expel air and reduce the air conditioning. Also, the shape of the roof is based on the traveling of air out of the building, so that hot air rises through a chimney-like object. Oh, that's it at night. So all the orifices bring out light. Simple. It's expensive, but it's simple. That's it in the day. And that's it from the side. So you can still see the existing warehouse, but you can see the swoop that we added to it. And because of this addition now, it has an iconic shape. And it's hopefully will perform for the environment. It's such a big building that it's difficult to make it 100% sustainable. But there's solar panels at the side, you know, the basic things are covered. But what's most important is that it's built to a certain cost. And we're able to make something that looks like architecture, even within those tight constraints, by actually dealing with the day-to-day of architecture itself. What does this cost? How do I take, for instance, we wrapped the building in rising at a point. And the rising was, I think, on 3 facades was about $1.5 million. In Africa, that's a lot of money. A lot of money. My contract is about 450 million naira. Nobody's going to give you that money, right? So we had to figure out how to make the building with concrete panels. For the concrete panels, we had to figure out how to allow the wind to sweep and water not to stain it, while doing it cheaply and made locally. So all the construction of this is being done locally. We're barely importing anything. Even the glass, if you look at the glass, you can see it looks like a jewel piece. It's actually normal sheets of glass that we just created a shape and a frame behind. It's not anything abstract. It's something that we're working directly with the contractors and the workshop people to make the glass. Right, so this is some weeks ago when they took off all the skin from the existing warehouse, and the frontal foundations are finished. Of course, you can see a crane in the background. So these guys have been brought to site. That the extension has been brought to site. So I believe that by now there will be 1 or 2 of them standing. I haven't been to that site. If you did. So another question is, should architecture harvest energy and food to power our lives? I mean, we do things like that, but we do it to greenwash build. But should we make it a formal thing that architecture in a city, one of its basic functions is to serve as an energy harvesting station, and also to help people to increase their food balance? Can architecture do that? So in 2016, we created a city prototype called Affordicity. The idea was to make a cheaper city for Africa around production. So that we had a series of farm towers that made the center of the city, connected by elevated pieces of land. So the basic concept for the housing which is in these H shapes, was that we build land, not houses. And therefore, if we're building land, I really don't bother how you live. I bother how the infrastructure of the land works and what that generates for the city. You plug in your house. It's an old idea that we made good of. So of course, the farm towers produce food, but they're a mix of office, food, industry to make one thing. And the only part of it that was a joke for us was these discs floating in the air. We put an avatar. So you see the animals walk around before. Yeah, but I mean, if I did it in America, I wouldn't survive. But that's fine. So it looked like that in full bloom. It looked like this in one of the smaller dense cities in Nigeria. This is Kano. So it can be anywhere. And by putting this anywhere, it amplifies the economic performance of this. It also forces architecture to be a production engine. I don't really know how these things look. I only know how they work, right? So it was exhibited in Nigeria and Germany by the German government, but it didn't go far because, of course, you know how architecture is. Architecture takes a long time to mature. So yeah, so we're still trying to make it into something that is buildable within time and budget, and something that is usable for not just Africa, but the world over. Because that's what we're trying to share an understanding of architecture around the world as against just Africa. So like I said, you can see that there's no houses, there's just elevated land. And of course, under the bridges, like in Lagos, people live under bridges. So we just kind of made bridge houses. I mean, it's a mute fact. Why don't we just do that? Right, so, yeah. So I'll just go back to this. Yeah, so, sorry. So this is one of the parts, which is this guy, which we're calling like a drone port tower. Of course, you can send drones out from it to different places to do different things, deliver food, blah, 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 around the city. But it also is heavily planted and can be transplanted in any part of Lagos or Los Angeles or Cairo. And it can bring, it's a big forest in the city, but it's made of an aquaponic system. And that's what makes the facade. The aquaponic pipes are the facade, right? And then harvesting happens in the floors behind the aquaponic pipes. Then the extra space can be used for schools. It can be used for other things. And the roof of it is a big funnel that catches the rain, and then we harvest the water from the pit. So it becomes a usable object in any city in the world, which is very important for architecture today. It can also be put in the most rural areas. So architecture doesn't turn its back on the people who don't have. Instead, it amplifies their existence. Where there's no water, it helps them to have water. Where land is bad, it helps them to plant. Where there are no schools, it brings schools. It's not about beauty, it's not about form, it's just about efficiency and its performance. So this is a question that has always plagued me, because when you see ruins of cities, you see what looked like architecture, but it's not really architecture. But we architects are so proud of these ruins that we carry a disc from a cousin from ancient Greece and put it on our shelves and venerate it every morning, like we've seen Jesus Christ. But architecture is not left behind when cities die. Architecture dies with the city. But what if we could create architecture that could live and die with cities, and that its death was not a detriment to the city, right? So we asked this question in a competition in Dubai that we lost woefully. We were called to design an iconic mosque. We did everything else but design an iconic mosque. So we lost that. I'm very surprised they didn't kick us out of the competition. So what we did was just to create two roofs. One roof was the mosque, and then it had a roof on top of it that was made of the structure that poked out of the mosque. Those structures were palm leaves, right? That could open, they were tensile, that could open and close. So they opened in the morning when the first prayer was called, and they closed in the night when the last prayer was called. So the iconic part of the mosque was the fact that every morning when you wake up, it wakes up with you. And every night when you go to sleep, it goes to sleep with you. We thought it was a very funny idea. I don't think they appreciated our sense of freedom. We also said to them that we put a bridge to cross through the site, because we heard that Rihanna at that point had a problem in Abu Dhabi, that she went to go and see the mosque, Sheikh Zayed Mosque in Abu Dhabi, and she didn't want to dress up properly, so they had to give her one of the robes to wear. So I said, perhaps we could make a bridge that could see the mosque, but was not part of the mosque. So Rihanna could wear a bikini and life could go on just quite easily, right? So anyways, we lost the competition. That goes without saying. It looked like that. It was about pneumatics. It wasn't about architecture. It was about the fact that the roofs could do that. The roofs could do that. That was the iconic part of the roofs, and there was always, and the ground was a fountain. The entire ground was a fountain. So you never knew where water could spring out from. So you had to walk around, just like how you walk around and prevent yourself from sin in religion. You walk around gingerly inside like that and dodge the water. Again, funny to me, not funny to them. So at the outside, we had a school, for an Islamic school, with an amphitheater that dug into the school. So that amphitheater became the wall and the roof. And then behind it was the habitation and library for the imams and things like that. So it was a simple looking interior, bright walls, timber slats to make the mosque itself, and a pneumatic roof on top of it. And the mosque itself had a skylight that brought lighting, and there was a big empty space where people could pray, and people could concentrate to pray. Right, so one more provocation is, if architecture should purify the air of its immediate environment. Like I said at the beginning, traditional African architecture did this without being asked. But architecture today depends on the environment air to be damaged for it to function properly. That's what air conditioning is. It takes from the rich, takes from the poor to give the rich. It's something of that nature. Air conditioning is really bad for the environment, right? So again, in the Middle East, in Abu Dhabi, another vertical park system that we're designing, it's two upside down pyramids that stay on a very tiny lot of land and transform that land into a park, so that it's really not a building, it's just infrastructure, and people can inhabit it. It's just plain concrete and bamboo and steel support. So people can inhabit it and children can play safely. And that site, because Abu Dhabi is densely built. Abu Dhabi is like New York, but it's very low. It's oppressively low, but there's no space. So these lots of land could be turned into this gigantic idea that could help people to find another life around, and it also helps the city to actually breathe and turns the city into a system. So that's what it looked like. Now, I asked this question at the beginning. Shouldn't architecture have a series of fixed points that you can depend on, and that gives everybody the ability to be able to make form and make architecture? As bad a designer as you are, there are fixed points that once you go through those points, there's a basic good that can come out of the world. Shouldn't that be what architecture should be trying to do? Is that not what ubiquity is? So buildings, there's a basic kind of building that you can never go wrong doing. So the world is a better place because, right? That question never gets answered. But we're designing some houses. We're calling them the compact houses. I think presently put in for wholesale. The first compact house is called TCH01. is in a very small 450 square meters site. That's 4,500 square feet. In Africa, that's a small piece of land. Because in Africa, you get the typical lot of land you get is about 6,000 upward. That's the urban plot, right? So, but this is a smaller piece of land, and it's irregular, and it's landlocked. In fact, even to get a road to get into the client had to buy a strip of his neighbor's setback so that he could get into his house, right? So what we realized quickly when we got into the house was, as much as we wanted to make a system, there was no way we could make a house that had a lot of windows because there was a privacy concern. So we had to make an introverted house. So quickly, what came to mind is that question. That house I saw as a child, that there were environments within it and pavilions. That's the way. So instead of looking outside for your enjoyment, look inward. So you live outside, inside. Instead of trying to extend the outside to the inside, we're now trying to live outside, not inside. Africa is a place where you live outside. So the house is created around permeability. So its walls, like your skin. The skin is permeable. Your skin breathes. A large percentage of the air you take in is from your skin. But your skin has no visible pores. Of course, it does have pores, but they're not visible, not like your nostrils. So we're trying to make our walls act like a skin. So it takes in air and light, etc. But it's not the visible way, because in reality, in Africa, windows don't make sense, right? So that permeability will enable a building to act in a certain way and people to be able to live a certain life. So, of course, the roof is a floating farm. So it's not a pergola in the sense of pergola, but it's a floating farm where my client's wife can plant her vegetables so that all year round, she can harvest vegetables, and that reduces his food bill. So the house, again, has its farm, has its internal gardens, it's permeable, it doesn't depend on windows, it's compact, it has everything that the traditional houses had, but it packs a punch in a very small space. So the only kind of architectural trick that we had was to make this floating garden arm, which is just a canopy really, but it's a nice long cantilever. I mean, if you can't make architecture, we make cantilevers. Yeah. So yeah, this is being built now. It has 37 piles that go 60, about almost 70 feet into the ground. Soil is that bad. All that's been done. So the ground slab is being done, and that's going to be taken up. So as you can see around the site, it's built up, it's landlocked. So everybody, the neighbors all look into the site. So there was no way to look out. So we had to look in. So continue the language of looking inward. So when we did that house, we discovered that we realized that we had discovered the kind of house, right? So that we started to call it compact house. And then we started to try to extract the rules of that compact house so that we could make another compact house. The opportunity came, and then we designed this. So this is another compact house, same square meterage with that one, but it's a different shape. It's a rectangle. It has the same characteristics of with the other one. So it's a permeable building. It has a roof farm. It's just the same thing. I can present this the way I presented that. Same thing, but just that this one's land is really large, but we have a big piece of land, but we have a smaller wallet. So if you do the math, it's the same equation. So therefore, we come to the same solution in a different way, right? So these are the plans of the two houses. Look different, but if you look down, you see that the strategies to make those plans are the exact same. On the ground floor, half open, half closed, a little amount of walls. On the first floor, a side void, either on the right side or on the left side, to allow air pass through the permeable surfaces and percolate through the house. On the last floor, the entire building is shrunk into itself so that you can walk around the building and there's a farm over that floor. So it's the same building, but it's two different plans with the same result. Same square area, almost the same amount of columns. It's the same song, but we signed it in 2 different languages. So we're beginning to find rules by which we can make these compound houses and export those rules to other buildings so that there are surefire ways to make something that works for the environment. So how do we preserve and reuse our existing built mass? You've seen an adoptive reuse project already. We seem to be a studio that gets a lot of these kind of requests to reuse our existing built mass. So as of today, we got called to do some work in the center of Lagos. It's a very decrepit part of Lagos. It's called Lagos Island. People don't sell their land, so it has grown within itself since. That's when the returning slaves were brought back to Lagos. They were put on Lagos Island, right? So it's called the old Brazilian Quarter. So the houses are cramped. You have 90 square meters per house on very small lots, but they're cramped together and people don't sell their houses, so you can't make a big piece of land, right? So also, the government has built a big bridge just right in between the neighborhood, because these two parts of the neighborhood are the same, but there's a big bridge that divides the neighborhood into two. So our site is this dark blue spot here. There's a large, noisy, not noisy, but large, of course, there's prayers. There's a large mosque here and a large parking lot here, and then a road under the bridge here. Our site is 90 square meters. It has a house on it. 90 square meters means that our house is 6 meters by 15 meters. Setbacks in Nigeria are 3 meters on each side, 6 meters in the front and 3 meters behind. Basically, it means we can't build on this side. It's just, if you do the math, there's no way to build on that side. So we took some time, and this is what the site looks like. Like actually, it's a decrepit part of town. That's the bridge right behind there. That's the bridge showing. This is the existing. This is the property that we're asking. Maybe just demolish it and build something. There was no brief, so we had to develop something, right? So we noticed that people had started to multiply their houses, and there was a simple strategy. If you don't destroy the house, it means that you're preserving it. So you can extend that meterage as high as you can. So having realized that, we quickly just yeah. So that becomes the architecture. 60 square meters, elevated 6 meters above the ground. We kept the existing building, and then we created a different kind of building. Now our building, the first few floors up to where my cursor is, has no walls. So they're open floors, they're just open floors, so that filmmakers can come and make films there. If you want an office space, you're renting land, you're not renting buildings. So you bring your windows and fix them. Something that happens a lot, right? It's like a retrofit. So there are 3 penthouses on top, so that in case you are making a movie, for instance, and you need somewhere to stay, you can rent one of the penthouses and stay. So suddenly we have a new kind of building because we couldn't use the land in any other way. We created a new kind of building that is performative in nature and is architecture, but is non-architecture at the same time. So it becomes kind of an icon in the city. It changes the street dynamic, continues this old house in a new way. Yeah. That's it from the front. And that's it from the bridge. So suddenly, what was not architecture becomes a conversation starter. So this is a question for everybody. Should habitation be secondary to performance? I think the habitation is quite important, but not as important as how a building performs, because the environment around the building is bigger than the people who stay in it, right? So again, if you go back to that building I just showed you, and we look at it in a clay model, you can see that it's about the performance of the building. It has nothing to do with how the building. These penthouses are a consequence of, yeah, if people do some movies here, they'll need somewhere to stay. So yeah, so let's have something. So that becomes it's a replacement for the ground and a performative place. And because of how much planting happens there, it actually replaces all the trees in the neighborhood that are supposed to be there. We put them in one place. So the neighborhood is repaired by that building being there. So it's a simple equation. Again, we don't believe in virgin land. We wrote a whole manifesto about virgin land that was published in FRAC in France. It's unfortunate that they published it in French. I wrote it in English, but published in French, and I don't read French. So yeah, virgin land for us is quite a problem. My thesis in the early 2000s was about multiplying land on the sea. So it was a building that had shape, but it wasn't a building at all. It was just a stack of floors for people to come and do what they wanted to do. And so you see, it's coming full circle, and we're trying to build this in real time on a small lot. And it suddenly tells us that virgin land can be used in several other ways. Right. So also another building that we worked on is a little personal house in Abuja that we have created in a way that doesn't touch the floor that much. Right. So it touches the floor only on 2 points. So it's a bridge house. We wanted to make it it was supposed to be my house, but we realized that content creators would prefer to use it better than we would. They would have more to do with it than I would. I'm quite a boring person. So the facade opens up and turns into a solar panel collector in the morning. And at night, there's no sun, so it becomes one down, right? When you open that facade in the night, you can shoot like a projector, you can shoot a movie on the fence, and then sit in the raked seating and watch your movie through the open space. So it's a simple, efficient house. Like I said, I'm not this interesting a person. So a content creator will have much more to do with the roof. The entire roof is a green roof, so it's like putting a flower pot on glass. And then underneath the building is dug out, so that there's a cooler living room on the building. Again, simple, efficient. So that stepped raked living room becomes storage. All the storage is under the steps. So it's a simple house, it's open, but it gives the space for several activities to occur. That's the kitchen. So to conclude the lecture, we're trying to develop a manifesto for this kind of performative architecture, which I'm sure is what you've seen from how I started up till now, right? And this manifesto is very necessary because this picture is a picture of Al-Fahidi in the UAE. It's a traditional Arabian house. It has a wind tower that helps to pull air and cool the building. That wind tower enables the Arabian city to be as compact as possible. Now we forget that the Arabian city, the walls are almost touching each other. The roads are really small. The reason being, as hot as it is, this wind tower helps to make the house perform differently. So this is what architecture should be. It should be this guy, and everybody should know how to make that guy. And then anything added to that guy should be because the person who added it is a genius. But it doesn't mean that everybody shouldn't have a taste of that guy. So I spent, after the pandemic, studying these wind towers in Dubai. I'm trying to test my thesis to see if every wind tower, no matter how bad the architect was still performing in the same way and was still makeable in the same way. And my thesis was right? And that this compactness that I noticed in the city was as a result of this wind towers, and the thesis was right. So it means that architecture has a precedent for performativeness, but it has deviated to oscillate between less and more. Right, so of course, these are plans and sketches of the elevations of how the wind towers work. So, reverting back to the beginning, performatives are not beautiful. Beauty is not the essence of the architecture. They are made through a series of rules, and they are designed to enhance the output of the environment. That should be functional architecture in the 21st century. And this is why traditional African architecture, and indeed the architecture of the Middle East, should come to the fore of architectural learning and education to make our world a little more sustainable. So, in conclusion, if we looked at the traditional Hausa house, this is Gidan Seriki Megin in Zaria. It's a traditional, typical traditional Hausa house. You see it everywhere on the internet. If you analyze it, you realize that the build mass is these floating pavilions in a free space. And that free space, sometimes it's a farm, sometimes it's living space, etc., etc. And air and light flows not into the form, but around and through the form. So as the walls are permeable, the architecture itself is permeable. So it gives the architecture a way to contribute to the habitation of the people, right? And if you further analyze those forms, you then get to the fact that a typical courtyard is an extraction from the center of the form. In house architecture, the form is put into an open space. So it's not a courtyard, it's just free space. We need to call it what it is. Air flows around and through the form, but in a courtyard, air flows and bounces out, right? So it's two different ways of treating air, it's two different assumptions. And therefore, if we keep on pushing that, it means that our houses can turn into these pavilions floating in free space. And that can create a totally new way of making the house, making the city, and therefore making architecture. So the house must become a tool for outdoor living and a series of pavilions floating in free space. This is the thesis, right? Buildings must also become systems to enhance environmental performance. This also is the thesis. And most importantly, the building itself must become a citizen and must attribute to all buildings. Everything we attribute to a citizen must pay tax. It must have civic duties, it must have responsibilities. By doing that, we change architecture. We make the architect more responsible, and we make the cities perform better. So, no more artifact. The city must become a tool for energy and food ubiquity. And also, architecture itself must veer towards creating a certain kind of ubiquity. So, architecture must become more permeable. And that's my thesis. Thank you for your time.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
So I've, as I said, Sarah Trotter, I'm an assistant professor in landscape architecture.
Yeah.
And so much of what you showed resonated with me as a landscape architect because you really are talking about linear architecture and the idea that you're creating land where land is not available right now. And I just was reminded too of like moonflowers and morning glories. You know, they open in the morning and close at night. Flycatchers, and it's just your work is really so alive, and I love that. We were talking in my history and theory of modern landscape architecture class yesterday about critical regionalism, and I'm wondering, I mean, just everything you talked about resonated with this idea of really listening to the climate and the sort of topography and the wind, and then building, and using that as inspiration to build. I just wonder if that's something that you thought about, or is it just happenstance?
No, I'd like to say I did think about it like that, but not really.
It just happened.
It just happened. It just felt like a necessity for where we are right now. And how things happen that when you tend to try to solve a certain problem, you solve several problems layered on those. I think that's just good. But I'll take this and my next lecture, I'll say just
that. Well, thank you.
I have a question, James.
yes,
And it's related with the temporality of architecture that you probably, according to what you're saying, agree with. Like, good architecture is always good architecture. But what you're showing us, good architecture doesn't always look the same. So how do you sort of put these things together? Like, let me be more specific. You basically say architecture should be a clear response to the things that make you live better and make your environment more sustainable, things like that. We know more about that as time passes. Okay, part of it is just getting more knowledge. Part of it is developing new technologies, and that clearly is imprinted somehow in architecture. So, is good architecture always good architecture, or eventually is just part of the past and we need to move on, and then perhaps, so that's my question. And I have a second question if we have time.
Okay. That's a very good question.
And I'll tell you why. You're showing us beautiful examples of the past. And then what I assume is your architecture is like reinterpretations of that past. in the present. So the question is, so is it what made that good just how it worked, or also how it looks? And if it is only how it works, then why are you changing the aesthetics? And I'm being challenged here.
I saw that comment. Yeah, so good architecture is always good architecture. Good architecture in a way doesn't die. So aesthetics, on the other hand, are also just aesthetics. What makes architecture good, for instance, in traditional architecture, is really not how it looks, but several things like geometry come into mind, things like planning come into mind, things like materials, things like that come into mind. So you find that if you understand the spirit by which things are made, and you apply them with new technology, they would have to change the way the output has changed. It's like a computer program. You have all the data, and then you put it into Rhino. You get a certain product, you put it into AutoCAD, you get something. So good architecture is always good architecture, and good architecture is defined with the spirit of that architecture. But we can transfer that spirit with new technology to new architecture, which will look different, but will perform the same way as those old architectures. So that's basically what I'm trying to weigh as a thesis.
So does that make old architecture outdated, or is still good architecture?
It's still good architecture, but the problem with old architecture is that it's built in a certain material, and its form is a response to that material. So again, one strong argument I have against the contemporary kind of African milieu is the brownness of our architecture. Sudden brownness and reliance on what looks like mud, but really is concrete sprayed to look brown, right? Fact of it is, we can't build in mud. It's a bygone thing. It's a great material, but it's a bygone thing. We're in an age where things have to be made in an industrial fashion so that the quality can be controlled, it can be checked, and it can be delivered at Home Depot. And you can't do that for mud.
Okay.
Right, so it's that taking yourself out of the equation because you want to make a point doesn't really work in architecture. And building the past in the present doesn't work. If you build in mud, for instance, and make your architecture brown, it means you're making the same city blocks that our ancestors made. But we have lots that are 6 meters wide. How do you build in mud in 6 meter wide lot? Mud behaves the way it behaves because it has space around it to breathe, excuse me. You take away that space, mud is like concrete. So again, we have to just focus on how these new materials kind of generate their own aesthetic. But input in that aesthetic, the spirit that the old materials and the old architecture had, right? And that's what we call pavilions in free space. So, yeah.
You want the second question?
Yeah.
James, I have to go. Thank you, that was wonderful.
Well, the second question is related with you're appreciating some of the sort of essential values of modern architecture that you show as you present some of the ideas of Corbusier and everything. And you know how that ended. It ended, with metabolists being pure conventional. How do you know you're not going that way, in that direction? And you know what was the reaction? The reaction was architecture's got to be more than just function. Mm-hmm. And that basically throws back to the beginning, which is, by the way, happening again. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you're aware, but there's a lot of revivals of classical architecture in the 20s that makes absolutely no sense at all.
Michael Green.
Well, I mean, even more recent than that, but yes, great. So, yeah. How do you know where you were going?
I think we need to get there first. Because the trick of modernism, because of its intellectual rigor, it made it susceptible to academic interpretation. It wasn't what it was all the time. It was it looked honest, but it wasn't honest. Because Corbusier was a modernist, so also was Mies, so also was Inedu-George. And they were all saying that buildings should be stripped and made as clear as possible. Forms should be as pure as possible. They said it in 3 different ways. But Mies' interpretation gives birth to Rem Koolhaas, who gives birth to Biaki. And now we're in a mess. You know, so the problem is that excessive intellectualization of a simple idea. We need buildings to act better. We need a building to be a citizen. That's the idea. Buildings must be more permeable. That's the idea, right? It's not about an intellectual style. It's about a spiritual motive. And I don't think that spiritual motives can change in that way. But I'm open and excited to see what can happen. It'll be exciting to see somebody make a better business out of what's better. It'll be exciting to see.
I have hello, everyone. I have a question from Coleman Jordan. Coleman.
Yeah, okay. So can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, great. So first of all, I want to say thank you, James, for coming to Morgan State to do this presentation. I've been able to work with James and the collaboration with the African University Communication College and looking at the Pan-African City, basically, and understanding that process with our students. That being said, one of the things that's very interesting to me, and I may extend this a bit, but when you showed the image of the African artifacts of the versus the Picasso images and how Picasso takes on Cubism after being inspired by literally West African Dahomey inspirations, a couple things came to mind. First of all, Hassan Fathi, who looks at the architecture for the poor, but looks at also the constructs of this straight line, this sort of Western idea of perfection, which takes on this sort of id concept when I look at the Picassos and the others, where there's sort of desensitizing the element of the essence of humanity, I would say, and making sort of straight line edges out of that, sort of killing the essence of the being. So if that makes any sense. But when I look at the African aesthetic, I would qualify that the beauty, you're saying that beauty doesn't matter. But when I look at the African artifacts, beauty is inherently a part of the reality of understanding the human quality of the human essence of, like, the structures that you show, the sculptures of the human body. So I guess what I'm asking is, how do you, when I think about, I think beauty to me needs to be redefined in the sense of architecture, because I think in Western ideology, we're trying to define beauty because we define it every day, right? If we open up the Cosmopolitan or any of the fashion magazines, we're trying to tell you what beauty is. But when you look at the African aesthetic within the build form that you were showing, it doesn't ask that question. It takes into consideration the environment, it takes into consideration performance, it takes into consideration the essence of an element. So I guess I'm asking you in the broad context, how would you respond to understanding redefining beauty and versus African aesthetic and quality? Because your work is beautiful. You can't take that away, but it's beautiful in quotes, meaning that there's an African aesthetic or there's an aesthetic to it that's not defined by a specific term that defines what beauty is, if that makes sense.
Oh, that's a nice question. Yeah, it'll give me a headache. I don't have look at traditional African architecture, as we've seen, right? And artifacts, because I'd rather not call that art. As much as it ends up being very beautiful, which is undoubtedly beautiful, and the beauty is kind of enigmatic. It's not something you can describe. It also is, that beauty is not what is being, it's not, the goal of the work is not to be beautiful. The goal of the work is to capture an essence. And once that essence is captured in the best possible way, beauty becomes a natural consequence of said capture, right? So if we decide to redefine beauty, then we have to define beauty by parameters of, again, performance, in the sense that we tend to perfect our forms to act in a certain way, and therefore beauty becomes a consequence of said action. So you're right that the artifacts are beautiful, but I don't think that beauty was the goal of the artifacts. I think that their performance and their responsibility, for instance, the Africans, the sculptures, like what you call sculptures, but they're really just mini gods and she's and things like that. They were, and it was the essence of a god, that how man felt about the god. It was a feeling that was made in wood or stone, etc. And this is the reason why, after a while, those things will be buried in the ground. And then when explorers came to Africa, they dug the ground and they saw stuff under the ground and said, oh wow, these guys were here since the 15th century. Of course they were. Those things weren't supposed to leave the ground. The god had died, so they buried him. And now you dug it up and put it in the Tate. You know, and you ask why the world has problems. That's why. So the beauty, how beautiful those things are, the reason why they were made was the reason why they were made. So beauty is a distant consequence of the great work that comes from solving certain problems. So I wouldn't dispel beauty totally. I think that when something is beautiful because it solves problems, not because it wants to be beautiful, I'm all for that. But if it's just beautiful for beautiful sake, it's a twisting tower, it's a turning something, it's just a waste. It's solving nothing, it's doing nothing, and it's hard to make. It's wasting time and resources, right? So I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's my take on.
Yeah, I'm actually agreeing with you in the process. So when I look at the, quote unquote, the artifacts, African artifacts, like you're saying, they're not done, they're designed for the sake of beauty. They're designed in the sake of representation of whether it's the gods and or whatever, but it's capturing an essence of its function of spirituality or whatever it's capturing. So I think that what you're talking about within architecture, there's an essence there that I think that we need to begin to relate to a little more. And I think when we fall to the concepts of beauty, and I would say in the Western context, whether, say when I look about fashion magazines and all that, we try to, define what beauty is. And I think that's probably not the right direction for architecture, as you're stating. I think it happens inherently if you're following the essence and capturing the concept of what it is that you're defining or designing. So yes, yeah, you've answered my question.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Yeah. My name is Beji.
Oh, did you have?
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
James. Yeah. Sorry, I came late. I had some competing schedule today. So, but the few presentations I saw, I must comment on job. I have a question and a request. Yes. My question is, I saw the traditional Hausa diagram, and in your statement, you wish or you encourage such practices to be duplicated in every part of the world. Yes, especially but my question here is, do you think? Okay, let me go this way. I believe such concept of design emanated because of the tropical region. Yes, Catella, and the one in the northern part of Nigeria, which is the Hausa diagram, and that of the Dubai. Talking about the wind tunnel. My question goes this way: do you think such can actually function or can be replicated in other parts of the world, given the kind of region in which those parts of the world are? And if that is, how do you think that can actually, because they're actually beautiful, because the fact remains that given the fact that you can, the kind of, what it entails, the fact that a building can be designed in such a way that air can flow in and around it easily, it's actually good. It will actually make sense if such can happen in every part of the world. But how do you think that can be? Yes.
Thank you.
Then my request is that.
Okay, maybe, let me answer the question. Like I said, I don't know, so I might forget everything. You know. Okay, thank you, Deji. So look, the reason why house and traditional architecture is something that I have based my architectural research on is because, like how, let's say the South Africans, yeah, create wonderful music and beautiful paintings, right? Yeah. At the beginning of the lecture, I said Nigeria. You remember the map of Nigeria, right? In my mind, I see it in 3 bands. In the north, there's a high architectural thinking. The architecture is precise. In the southern parts of Nigeria, however, especially the Yoruba parts, where you're from, there's a very refined way of singing. That's why Afrobeats came from Yoruba land. Could that come from anywhere else? Can you imagine Afrobeats coming from the north? No, can't. No way. And the middle belt, they call it the food belt of the country for a reason. All the good dishes, egusi, all that comes from that middle belt and spreads around, right? So we have to understand our regions like that. That's one. Two, you know, house architecture and this architecture of that great Zimbabwe are about the same. The planning is about the same. In a way, Yoruba architecture, which depends very, very, very deeply on the courtyard as an improvement, yes? If you take away the doors, it's the same idea. If you look at it, just look at it critically, take away the doors and all the funny partitions, yeah? It's the same idea. Same thing with Igbo architecture. In fact, the Igbos have something that they call the Ogo house. It's like a temple, right? It's a big roof that air flows on. In Idoma land, it's called an Ogwa. In the people in the Dogons call it a Toguna, right? So African architecture, while distinct looking, is the same thing, said in different tones, right? That's number one. Number two, if we found this as a way to make a house, right? There's a possibility of making it work for temperate places as well as non-temperate places, right? Choice of material, orientation, how close pavilions are together, and things like that. So I've done the work of digging up this idea that we can run with. I think the rest of the work has to be done by other people. Because one person really can't solve the entire math equation. Somebody finds the equation and then somebody else proliferates. So maybe that's where you come in. So what's your request?
Is that I wish the recording of this meeting be made available to us, or probably the PDF copy of the presentation.
Okay. I'm leaving the PDF copy on this computer for you.
Okay.
So, and then I'm sure there's a recording, of course, for the last part. You can probably get that. So. Any more comments?
Yeah, kind of question, comment. I made me think about a lot of different things throughout, and you know, you're talking about art and artifacts, and just in our history of architecture studies, it seemed like in a lot of cases, architecture followed art throughout. And you know, you think about like, well, what's the function of some of these buildings, and sometimes just to look pretty or whatever. And so I thought it was interesting. I'm trying to put this together in a way that makes sense, but that you mentioned that the things that would be art in African architecture are more spiritual, and they represent spirit. So if you know that these things that would be art are translate to architecture and the spirit of architecture, and thinking about the buildings that you're talking about making, which are, the function is what's important, and how it serves people and serves a community and serves the city. I think that's very interesting. And I've always kind of struggled, like thinking about going into this, how the architecture is very expensive. It's it's for rich people, and how can that serve? I guess that's a question. How can these architects serve people that aren't the 1%? And is that making these larger buildings that can serve everybody?
I think it's first asking the question of affordability. We've created a system of architecture that can't be built by normal people. And it gets worse every year. You have new rules every time. And so even to get approvals to build your small concrete shed that you can afford, there are rules layered on rules layered on rules. Now there's carbon rules, there are rules layered on rules that end up making something that's not hospitable to you and can't be built. The question then becomes, whose fault is that? Is that the fault of the government, whose job is to make rules, or the fault of the architect, whose job is to find a way around the rules? So somebody's not doing his job, and my money is on the architect, right? So until we are able to find these kind of ways around issues like this, we won't be able to build for anybody that's not in the 1%. And how many of the people in the 1% are there, right? There are 120 freshmen in the schools here, as I heard today. 120 in 2023. And you guys have been here, as I heard today, since 2013. So if we say an average of 80 students have come into this building since 2013, you guys have produced 800 architects. How many 1% people are there again? Right? So the math doesn't work. 1% don't need architecture. And we keep graduating architects in their hundreds every year. Who do we build for? How do we make money from building for the people who need building? That's where the money is at. If you solve the problem of affordable housing, let's do a quick math equation. In my country, 22 million housing is needed. That was like 2017. 22 million housing is needed to solve the affordable housing loss, right? If you're able to provide 22 million housing and make $2,000, if you're able to produce 1 million houses and make $2,000 from each house, what do you make? 2 billion. You're in the 1%. By solving the problem. But we're sitting out here waiting for Bill Gates to give us a big building so that we can win an award. And we pay for the awards. The awards rarely ever give us money. We pay. Average architecture award is about $4,000 a year. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's a senseless struggle. If it's money you're looking for, the money isn't professional. You just don't know how to make it. If it's fame you're looking for, solve the problem. If it's to make the environment better, solve the problem. The answer in IT is solve the problem. So we're not solving problems. When we build for Bill Gates has no problems. He has no problems. He can afford air conditioning. So. Yeah.
Or did you finish your question?
No, thank you very much.
I had a question about kind of the distinction between the architect and architecture. What I'm seeing in you and hearing from you is that at some point along your career of architecture, you kind of took a step into the architect, or you took a step towards yourself as opposed to taking a step towards the totality of architecture. So I'm curious, as someone who's about to graduate and enter the field, of architecture, if you have any advice, especially from your experience and how you navigated that space, how you were able to channel the architect, the individual, and not let the totality of architecture, where we find ourselves in architecture, rule this idea of vision versus observation. At what point did you stop observing and start seeing or creating what is seen?
You know, at the point I used to write like that. I used to write, I read exactly. Okay, when I graduated, I wrote a book called Lagos Chaos Theory, refused to publish it, but it read exactly like Great Leap Forward. Exactly. But what I was saying in the book had some real meaning, but how I said it was not my voice. And so every time I gave the book to somebody to edit or read for me, it was, I feel like giving a piece of rem to the person. So I had to step back and ask myself, what is it I'm seeing that makes sense? And why is it so important these days to learn from Las Vegas, for instance? I don't want to learn from Las Vegas. There's no reason to learn from Las Vegas. Apart from if you're designing a building in Las Vegas, I don't see any reason why I should learn from it. I don't think it's the greatest city in the world. New York is there, and we're not really learning from New York, right? We see New York, we observe New York, but we don't want the entire world to look like New York. There must be variants, right? So those are the questions I started to ask, and then I started to travel. I started to see that we're all doing the same thing, all running after the next museum, the next award, and the next shopping mall, and the output, next airport. The outputs were insane. I find myself in an airport in country X, and I don't know where I am. And I have I'm sure you've noticed my memory is very sharp. I wake up, I come out of the plane, and maybe I'm in Singapore. I have to check my phone. So those things added and accumulated to me asking myself, what should architecture do? And where do I fit into the game? And I also have a people behind me, right? I didn't go to school and have this talent to become an architect because I wanted to buy a new car, right? Where I came from, I could afford that. I didn't need to go to school to survive, right? So when I did go to school, because I had a talent, I had to ask myself, how do my people benefit from that talent? Then I started to build an office. And like I told you earlier, when you lead people, you see the world a little bit differently. And when you start trying to become an architect, you embrace your anxiety and you embrace your need to control everything. And so your narrative changes. Because again, the world has been written in a certain way, and several of those points are not very realistic, if I must say that, right? I don't know if that helps.
Extremely. Your entire presentation has been very enlightening, and we are grateful. I think more students.
Thank you. I think Kuma has hands up, or he's dropped in once.
Yeah, when you were talking earlier about the, I don't know who had asked the question about the architecture for the wealthy or those that have the power to build. I do think about people like Hassan Fathy, who did the architecture for the poor, who looked at that, and then also MegaCity in the US, who began to look at rural designs within the impoverished areas of the United States. And it's trying to, begin to look at an aesthetic and or as well as a function for people in those areas that are not actually thought of for design. I guess I was just trying to get a understanding of where you are. When I look at your images, like this image is just beautiful that you have on screen, but many of the images that you show, like a lot of, I look at the cars that are there, and those are very high, the Teslas, the whatever. It doesn't look like architecture for the poor. However, I do wonder how you begin to translate and understand the concepts of someone like a Hassan Fathy, who looks at architecture for the poor in relationship to the African continent in general, mostly North African, but then also someone like MegaCity, who is looking at the American South, which has another type of a history, and how you begin to, design for everyone in that concept. So I just question that. I don't know how to answer that or how to respond, but I'm just looking for, wondering how you are thinking about that.
I want everybody to have a modern house. 21st century. Because everybody has a modern car. Why shouldn't everybody have a modern house? We can't revert to the past. I love Hassan Fati. But in the 21st century, we can't escape anymore. There's no way to make the argument of escape anymore. We've exhausted all channels for that argument. Everybody has a modern car, modern cell phone. Everybody's on the internet. Our shoes are all made yesterday night. Our clothes are modern. So therefore, it's everybody's right, like it's the right of everybody to have internet, to have a modern, in fact, a contemporary house. So I think that's part of our job, to make the contemporary ubiquitous. That's part of our job. And we have to figure that out without becoming Hassan Fati or Francis Kerry. We have to figure that out. I think I'm leaving that as a class, as an assignment for you home.
Okay, I'll take that assignment on. I think that's good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone.
But that's it. Thanks a lot. Joe, appreciate it. I'll be over there in a second.